Picture a war room. You have the most brilliant military strategists, the wealthiest heads of state, and the sharpest political minds. And they're all huddled around a massive table.
Right, the ultimate think tank.
Yeah, precisely. They are moving pieces on a map, drafting legislation, pooling their vast resources to overthrow a supreme ruler. And they are entirely confident.
Oh, absolutely. They have the numbers, the wealth, the weapons. They've calculated every single variable.
But, what they'd fail to realize is that the ruler they are plotting against is not sitting in a rival capital. He is the one who created the map itself.
Yeah, he forged the iron in their weapons.
Exactly. Spot on.
Yeah.
He sustains the very oxygen in their war room. And as he watches their grand secretive conspiracy unfold, he does not mobilize troops. He does not break a sweat. He
just laughs.
It is a staggering image.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, our deep dive is an intense textual investigation of the Net Bible First Edition notes on Psalm 2.
And our objective today is singular and very focused. Right. We're going to understand the precise grammatical nuances, the historical context of the ancient Near East, and the theological significance of human rebellion against God's preordained decrees.
We are essentially pulling apart the vocabulary of hubris. We are looking at what happens when finite creatures attempt to arm wrestle the infinite creator.
And before we jump into the verses, let's lay out our theological framework for you, the listener. We are viewing this through a strictly Reformed theological lens.
Yes, we are Protestant Christians, and our framework for analyzing these verses adheres to the Westminster Confession of Faith.
So as we read through the rebellion of the nations, we will be evaluating it against the backdrop of God's absolute sovereignty and the total depravity of the human heart.
The contrast between the scheming of humanity and the decree of heaven requires us to look really closely at the Hebrew text, the Aramaic cognates, and the ancient Near Eastern treaty language.
And just a quick reminder on our ground rule for the show. Both of us are committed to letting each other finish our complete thoughts. There is zero interrupting or talking over one another here. We want a clean, respectful dialogue.
Absolutely. Good ground rule.
So let us begin right at the ground level with verses 1 through 3. We start by looking at the chaotic actions of humanity before the camera pans up, so to speak, to shift our gaze to heaven.
Right. Verse 1 opens with a rhetorical question. Why do the nations rebel?
And the psalmist is not looking for an informational answer there, right? He's not confused by the geopolitical landscape.
No, not at all. He's expressing absolute outrage at the audacity of the nations rebelling against God and his chosen king.
He is looking at this global conspiracy and asking, what possesses you to think this could possibly work?
And that outrage is captured brilliantly in the Hebrew vocabulary. The text uses the verb regash for this rebellion.
Regash. That is a pretty rare word, isn't it?
It is an exceedingly rare word. In fact, it occurs only here in the entire Hebrew Bible.
Wow, only here. So how do we figure out what it actually means?
Well, to figure out its precise shade of meaning, we have to look outside the immediate Hebrew lexicon and consult its Aramaic cognate.
Ah, right. And we find that in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, I believe.
Yes, specifically chapter 6. So if you recall that narrative, Daniel has been elevated to a massive position of authority in the Persian Empire under King Darius.
And the other government officials, the satraps and administrators, they are just consumed with envy. They want to tear Daniel down.
Precisely. And the Aramaic cognate of regash is used to describe how these officials acted as a conspiring group.
They did not just formally petition the king.
No, they formed a restless, murmuring, mob-like assembly. They were whispering in the government halls.
So when the psalmist uses regash in Psalm 2, he is looking at the nations and seeing the same type of whispered collective plotting.
Yes. It is not a formal declaration of war delivered by an ambassador. It is a restless, chaotic, underground scheming.
And the vocabulary continues to build that specific picture of underground plotting. The notes point to the Hebrew verb haga.
Haga, yeah. That is a fascinating word.
Normally, when you encounter this word in the biblical text, it means to recite quietly or to meditate.
Like meditating on the law of the Lord day and night.
Right. It brings to mind the image of a cow chewing its cud. A slow, deliberate, repetitive process of digestion.
But here, that word takes on a metonymic meaning. It means to devise, plan, or plot.
They are not chewing on the law of God. They are chewing on their hatred of it.
And the shift in that word reveals something vital about the anatomy of sin.
How so?
Well, meditation is a slow, deliberate focus of the mind. By using a word associated with quiet meditation to describe political and spiritual rebellion, the text illustrates that this rebellion is not a spontaneous crime of passion.
Ah, so the nations are not just lashing out in a momentary, irrational fit of rage.
No, they are ruminating on their hostility. They are chewing on their resentment toward God's authority.
It is a calculated, heavily internalized hostility. The kings of the earth are actively engaged in planning their own rebellion, savoring the thought of their own autonomy.
And we also see the phrase devising emptiness, or the Hebrew word rik.
Rick? That word is fascinating because it does double duty, right?
It really does. On one hand, it indicates the guaranteed outcome of their plots.
Meaning, no matter how much they scheme, the result will be a vacuum. It will just fail.
Spot on.
Bruh.
But on the other hand, Rick highlights their total moral bankruptcy. The very substance of their meditation is void of any moral weight.
Then, verse 2 introduces the kings of the earth. The notes classify this as a hyperbolic reference.
Yes, these are not equal superpowers squaring off against God. These are kings who had already been conquered by and were subject to the Davidic king.
So they are vassal kings. And they take their stand and conspire together using the Hebrew verb yasad or its alternate form sud.
Which gives us a physical posture of defiance.
Finally, in verse 3, we see their actual goal. They want to throw off the shackles.
They view the righteous rule of the Lord and his vice-regent as a literal prison.
And this is where we must apply our reformed framework, specifically the doctrine of total depravity, to understand the mechanics of this rebellion.
Yes, total depravity, as articulated in the Westminster Confession, teaches that humanity, through the fall, has wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation.
So as a natural man, being altogether averse from that good and dead in sin, he is not able, by his own strength, to convert himself.
Right. His default setting is hostility toward his creator.
When we read that the kings of the earth view God's decrees and righteous laws as shackles to be cast off, we are seeing the raw exposure of the unregenerate heart.
Humanity in its natural state does not view God's law as a protective boundary or a loving guideline. They view it as chains.
They perceive divine authority as tyranny.
And they gather together, and their quiet meditation, their Haga, is entirely consumed with how to break free from the one who sustains their existence.
Think about it like a group of disgruntled corporate employees. They are whispering around the water cooler, having these quiet, hushed conversations.
Yeah, devising a hostile takeover of the company.
Exactly. They are drafting emails on company laptops, organizing secret meetings in the company boardroom, and convincing themselves they have the leverage to pull this off.
But they are completely oblivious to the fact that the CEO they are plotting against personally owns the very building they are standing in.
Right. He owns the water cooler they are whispering around. He signs the paychecks that allow them to feed their families.
Their plot is completely detached from reality.
They are using the resources given to them by the ruler to plot against the ruler. It is just absolute emptiness.
It really is.
But I have a question about this. If their plotting is so obviously futile, and if they're meditating on this so heavily, why does their intellect fail to grasp the absurdity of their situation?
Well, the failure of their intellect is a direct symptom of that total depravity. Depravity does not just corrupt the moral compass, it darkens the mind.
It makes humanity fundamentally irrational when it comes to the things of God.
Yes. The Apostle Paul writes about this in his letter to the Romans, describing how humanity suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. And as a result, their foolish hearts were darkened.
These kings are highly educated. They are military tacticians. They are political savants.
But their spiritual deadness creates a massive blind spot. Sin demands autonomy. It screams that the creature can usurp the creator.
So they surround themselves with their own military might, their own wealth, and their own sycophantic counselors.
Creating a massive echo chamber that reinforces their delusion of strength.
They look at their chariots and their gold, and they convince themselves that they can sever the invisible cords of divine sovereignty.
Which brings us perfectly to the second major movement of the text, covering verses 4 through 6, the sovereign's reaction from the throne.
Right. Because the earthly kings have plotted a futile rebellion, the logical next step is to examine the direct reaction from the heavens.
We just spent time analyzing the restless, murmuring, plotting chaos of the nations.
And now, that chaos is met with the absolute stillness of God. Verse 4 describes God as sitting, using the Hebrew verb yashav.
The translators know this is used metonymically for sitting enthroned.
He is not pacing the floors of heaven in anxiety. He is entirely secure.
The juxtaposition is deliberate and stark. Down on Earth, the kings are raging, taking their stand, sweating over their maps, and forging their weapons.
Up in heaven, God is seated. He is at rest.
And his reaction to this global, coordinated rebellion is derisive laughter and scoffing.
The grammatical structure here is really significant, right? The Hebrew imperfect verbal forms in verses 4 and 5 are doing heavy lifting.
They absolutely are. Hebrew verbs often communicate aspect rather than strict tense.
In this case, the imperfect forms describe the action from the perspective of an eyewitness watching the divine response unfold in real time.
Yes, the psalmist is pulling the reader into the throne room, placing you right there, watching the Almighty laugh at the absurdity of the human plot as it happens.
I want to look at the theological implications of this laughter from our Reformed framework.
Okay, let's do that.
The Westminster Confession teaches the immutability of God. He does not change, and his eternal decrees are fixed.
He is outside of time, declaring the end from the beginning.
So when we look at God sitting enthroned and laughing, it is a flawless illustration of absolute sovereignty.
Earthly conspiracies, no matter how widespread, well-funded, or organized, do not threaten the eternal decrees of God in the slightest.
He laughs because the outcome is already preordained. There is no alternate timeline, no multiverse scenario where the kings of the earth successfully overthrow the Creator.
Their failure is as certain as God's existence.
What do you think is the psychological impact on these rebellious kings when they realize that the Creator of the universe is not threatened by their rebellion but actually mocks it?
The psychological impact would be devastating. Think about how conflict works among peers.
Right, if an enemy takes your rebellion seriously, if they mobilize troops, declare a state of emergency, and show signs of worry, it validates your strength.
Exactly. It tells you that you are a legitimate threat. It feeds your ego.
But when the target of your rebellion responds with derisive laughter, it completely strips away the illusion of autonomy and might that you have spent your whole life building.
It exposes your nakedness and your absolute impotence. It communicates that the gulf between the creator and the creature is infinite.
The kings realize they are finite, fragile beings attempting to intimidate the infinite God.
And the text notes that this mocking does not remain as laughter. It shifts to terrifying rage in verse 5.
The language focuses heavily on the psychological terror this anger strikes into the rebellious kings.
God is not just dismissing them. He is speaking to them in his anger and terrifying them in his fury.
Then, in verse 6, the Lord speaks his first direct words in the psalm.
He uses an emphatic first-person pronoun, which translates to, I myself have installed my king.
He does not say, my king has managed to secure his throne. He says, I myself have done this.
That emphatic pronoun is the linguistic hammer that shatters the rebellion. God is declaring his unmediated, direct action in the political affairs of the earth.
He has placed his king on Zion, his holy hill.
The earthly kings were trying to throw off the shackles, but God responds by pointing to the heavy, immovable reality of his chosen vice-regent.
He silences the chaotic murmuring of the nations by declaring a fixed, unalterable fact.
The installation of the king is not up for negotiation. It is not subject to a democratic vote among the nations. It is a divine decree.
And this moves us into verses 7 through 9. The decree, the son, and universal dominion.
God's scoffing gives way to a formal declaration of his established order.
The Davidic king now speaks in verse 7, relating the Lord's decree, You are my son. Today I have become your father.
This is where the historical context becomes really vital. We are dealing with ancient Near Eastern adoption language associated with covenants of grant, a concept heavily researched by scholars like M. Weinfeld.
The covenant of grant is a crucial key to unlocking this passage, isn't it?
It really is. In the ancient Near East, political relationships were defined by specific types of covenants.
You had suzerain vassal treaties, where a greater king demanded loyalty from a lesser king under threat of curses.
But the covenant of grant was entirely different. A lord or a great king would reward a remarkably faithful subject by elevating him to a special status.
This elevation was legally referred to as sonship.
Right, like a literal son, this faithful subject received an inheritance which was viewed as an unconditional eternal gift.
This usually took the form of a vast tract of land or the promise of a lasting dynasty.
So when the Lord says to the Davidic king, You are my son, he is utilizing this widely recognized ancient legal and political language.
He is not talking about biological reproduction. He is making a legal declaration of status and inheritance.
And the scale of that inheritance is what makes this text so massive.
In a typical ancient covenant of grant, the faithful servant might get a few cities or a fertile valley.
But in verse 8, the Lord expands the scope entirely. The inheritance promised here is universal dominion.
The Lord says, "Ask me, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance, the ends of the earth as your personal property."
He is giving the very nations that were plotting rebellion in verse 1 to the king as an inheritance.
This requires us to look closely at a huge textual criticism detail in verse 9.
Yes, we encounter a serious translation debate regarding what the king will do to these nations.
The Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, reads, "You will shepherd them."
This Greek reading is highly influential because it is actually quoted multiple times in the New Testament, specifically in Revelation 2.27, 12.5, and 19.15.
This Greek translation assumes the underlying Hebrew word is ra, which means to shepherd.
However, the Masoretic text, the authoritative Hebrew text we rely on, has a vocalization that favors the word ra, which means to break.
And the translators of the Net Bible argue strongly that the context supports the Masoretic text's reading of break.
Just look at the surrounding vocabulary to see why break makes more sense. The very next line uses the Hebrew word nafatz, which means to smash.
You also have the king wielding a royal scepter, a shebet.
In the ancient world, a royal scepter was not a shepherd's crook used for guiding sheep. It was often a heavy mace.
A weapon of war symbolizing absolute sovereignty and the might to crush opposition.
And the nations are explicitly compared to fragile pottery being smashed to pieces.
The imagery is unyielding. A clay jar struck by an iron mace does not just crack, it shatters into useless shards.
You do not smash a flock of sheep, you shepherd them, but you absolutely smash a rebellious vessel.
The iron scepter represents a rule that will not bend or compromise.
The nations, despite all their plotting, their vast armies, and their grandstanding in verses 1 through 3, are revealed to be nothing more than fired clay going up against solid iron.
I want to push back on this imagery for a second, just to play devil's advocate.
Sure, go for it.
If the nations are already like fragile pottery, if they're fundamentally weak and easily shattered, why did they perceive themselves as capable of breaking the shackles of an iron scepter?
Yeah, how do they develop such a massive blind spot regarding their own fragility?
Exactly.
Well, that blind spot is the psychological outworking of their depravity. They surround themselves with the trappings of status chariots, gold, fortresses.
In the human realm, these things constitute strength.
They judge their durability by looking at their neighbors who are also made of clay.
So compared to another clay pot, a reinforced clay pot looks invincible.
Spot on. They fail to understand the difference in material. They are measuring themselves against horizontal, earthly standards rather than the vertical, divine standard.
They forget that the breath in their lungs is on loan from the God they are defying.
Furthermore, connecting this to our broader theological framework, this covenant of grant given to the Davidic king is a direct foreshadowing of the covenant of grace.
In Reformed theology, we understand that the promises made to David point to Jesus Christ.
Christ is the true and final Son, the perfect mediator. The absolute inheritance of the nations belongs to him.
He is the one who will rule with an iron scepter, and his dominion is truly universal and eternal.
The Davidic king in Jerusalem was a local, temporal, imperfect picture of the cosmic, eternal reality of Christ's reign.
The transition from the local Davidic king to the cosmic reign of Christ forces a decision upon the listener. This brings us to verses 10 through 12, the ultimatum submission or swift destruction.
Because the Son has been installed with universal dominion and an iron scepter, a definitive choice is forced upon the earthly kings.
Neutrality is entirely impossible. You cannot simply opt out of this kingdom or declare yourself a non-combatant.
The text highlights that the speaker, whether it is the psalmist or the king himself, directly addresses the rebels.
The verb used to address them is in the niphal stem and carries what grammarians call a tolerative nuance.
This means the kings are being urged to submit to the advice being given.
They are commanded to yield to the Lord's sovereignty, which, in their historical context, practically meant paying regular tribute to the Davidic king.
The requirement for tribute is standard ancient Near Eastern protocol. When a vassal king submitted to a suzerain, he proved his loyalty by sending gold, resources, and military aid.
But the psalmist moves past just monetary tribute into heavier emotional and spiritual territory.
This brings up two huge translation debates that alter how we read the text.
First, there's the phrase, traditionally rendered, rejoice with trembling.
The verb used here is gil, which usually means rejoice.
However, linguists argue that rejoicing does not fit well in conjunction with the phrase, in trembling. You do not typically throw a party while shaking in terror.
Instead, it is highly likely that Gil here carries a polarized meaning. In certain contexts, like Hosea 10.5, it means to mourn or lament.
This mourning acts as a metonymy for repenting of their rebellious ways.
They are not being told to have a terrified celebration. They are being told to weep and repent over their treason.
The idea of lamenting makes far more logical sense in the context of an ultimatum. Then we reach the second and perhaps most famous translation debate in this psalm, the phrase, "kiss the Son."
This phrase is heavily embedded in Western Christianity. It is in classic hymns, it is preached from pulpits, and it is in almost every classic English translation.
But the translation relies on the word bar, which is Aramaic for son, not Hebrew.
The Hebrew word for son is ben, which was already used earlier in the psalm.
Dropping a single Aramaic word into the middle of a Hebrew poem is highly unusual, and it makes scholars suspicious of this reading.
The linguistic analysis suggests it makes much better sense to read bar as a standard Hebrew adjective meaning pure, functioning adverbially.
Alternatively, some scholars suggest a conjectural emendation, adjusting the text slightly to read, "in trembling kiss his feet."
Regardless of the precise grammatical route, the verb nashak, meaning kiss, is clearly metonymic for showing homage or submission.
To understand why this specific type of homage is demanded, we have to look at the historical context of the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon.
Esarhaddon was a king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC. He was a master of psychological warfare and political control.
When he made treaties with vassal kings, he knew that a king might swear an oath of loyalty with his lips while secretly planning a future rebellion in his heart.
They might pay the tribute, but sharpen their swords in the basement.
The Esarhaddon treaties explicitly warned vassals against this exact behavior.
They contained terrifying, detailed curses invoked upon anyone who swore the oath with only their words but did not commit with their entire heart.
The psalmist is issuing a remarkably similar warning. It is not enough to simply pay the monetary tribute.
It is not enough to perform the outward ritual of kissing the king's feet. The homage must be sincere. The repentance must be genuine.
God sees through diplomatic theater. But, the phrase, "kiss the Son" is so famous.
Yes, it is.
How should a reader process this when grammatical evidence points toward a different reading, like "sincerely pay homage" or "kiss his feet in purity"? Does losing that traditional phrasing change the theological impact of the passage?
Well, it requires a shift in how we read our Bibles, certainly.
Yep.
But a rigorous analysis of the text requires us to go where the grammar leads.
Right.
In this case, adjusting the translation does not diminish the theological impact at all. It sharpens it.
Because the traditional reading, "kiss the Son," points clearly to the person of the king.
But the linguistically tighter reading, "sincerely pay homage," points to the necessary posture of the human heart.
From a Reformed perspective, God demands the whole person. He does not want the hypocritical lip service that the Esarhaddon treaties warned against.
He demands total internal submission. The theological reality remains identical. The rebellious nations must bow to God's chosen king.
The clarified translation simply spotlights that this submission must be authentic, rooting out the insidious hidden rebellion of the heart that we saw back in verse 1.
Following this demand for sincere homage, the text moves to a stark warning. The language used for drawing anger is a specific technical term.
It indicates an anger that can burn quickly like fire, which was the most destructive force known in ancient Israel.
They did not have explosives. A fast-moving fire was the ultimate uncontrollable destruction.
The warning states that the rebellious kings will perish in the way, using the Hebrew word derek.
This word derek is functioning syntactically as an adverbial accusative. It does not refer to a physical pathway or road they are walking on.
It refers to their behavior, their rebellious conduct. They will perish in the very act of their rebellion.
Their destruction is tied inextricably to their conduct. But the psalm does not end on the note of burning fire and shattered pottery.
No, it ends with a blessing.
The word for blessing is an abstract plural, denoting a comprehensive state of happiness, security, and well-being.
This blessing is reserved for those who take shelter in him.
This phrase is a well-known biblical idiom for seeking protection.
In the ancient world, seeking a king's protection fundamentally demonstrated loyalty to that king.
You did not ask a rival king to protect you unless you were submitting to his rule.
In the theology of the Psalms, taking shelter in the Lord is the exact opposite of the wicked plotting we saw in verse 1.
It is the ultimate expression of faith, dependence, and allegiance.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's summarize the severe contrast we have examined.
Good idea.
On one side, We have the empty, morally bankrupt, whispered plotting of humanity. It is driven by a depraved desire to cast off the righteous authority of God.
They are chewing on their own hubris.
On the other side, we have the secure, preordained decrees of God, who sits enthroned outside of time, mocks the futile schemes of men, and installs his chosen king with universal dominion.
The contrast is between the fragile, fired clay of human ego and the unyielding iron scepter of divine sovereignty.
And this contrast is not just an academic exercise in theology, it has immediate real-world application.
The notes briefly reference Psalm 3, which provides a perfect historical example of this theology lived out.
According to the historical superscription, David wrote Psalm 3 while fleeing Jerusalem during a massive violent coup led by his own son, Absalom.
This was an actual breathing conspiracy. The kings of the earth, or in this case, the leaders of Israel, were literally plotting against him.
They had the numbers and they had the momentum.
Yet in Psalm 3, David relies entirely on the divine oracle of Psalm 2. He puts the concept of taking shelter into immediate practical action amid a real-world crisis.
He writes that he lies down and sleeps securely, knowing that salvation belongs to the Lord.
He understands that God's decrees cannot be overturned by a military coup or a slick political campaign. He views his physical reality through the lens of God's sovereign decree.
David lived out the theology of Psalm 2 while running for his life in Psalm 3. He knew the pottery could not break the iron.
He absolutely did.
That brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to carry with you. We have spent this time seeing that God's decrees are entirely secure, and that human rebellion is as futile as a clay jar striking a mace.
It is a sobering reality.
So, I want to leave you with this question to chew on.
Yeah.
If this is the absolute reality of the universe, how does that change the way you read the daily news regarding the political plotting, the closed-door meetings, and the geopolitical posturing of modern nations?
Something to really think about.
Keep analyzing the text closely, and we will see you next time on our next deep dive.